We want to welcome everybody today to our Exponential webinar, Partnering with Global Migration for Movement and Multiplication. My name is Dave Ferguson, and I have just really the privilege to be both the president and CEO of Exponential. And we're going to explore kind of the impact of immigration on church movements in America. We're going to kind of go back a little bit and dive into some of the historical context, but then also kind of take a look at a case study and really some of the current opportunities I think it is for the church today. And I think it's a really great opportunity for you to engage in a really important conversation. And in fact, as you're logging on, you'll notice there's a Q&A button there at the bottom. Use the Q&A button. I got a whole bunch of questions I want to ask our panel, and I'm interested in hearing what they're going to have to say. But even more important than my questions, I would love for you to get a chance to ask your questions. So as you log those in there, I'll try to even interrupt what's going on to get to your questions. So we are answering the questions that you're asking and not just the questions that I'm asking. We do have a terrific panel with us here for this webinar. Daniel Yang is here, one of my favorite people. Daniel serves as the National Director of Churches of Welcome for World Relief. But I think one of the things that's really cool about this is not only does he have an expertise and a passion in this area, but he also brings to it, to our Exponential audience, he's a serial church planner. He's planted churches in Detroit, in Dallas, in Toronto, and in my hometown, Chicago. And he's also has a brand new book that Exponential Next and Zondervan are publishing together, Future Ready Church, 8 Shifts to encourage and empower the next generation of leaders. I would really, really encourage you to make sure you get a copy of that. Even touches on some of the things we're talking about today. In addition to that, we have Wes Dillon with us. Wes is the co-leader of Four Rivers Church, a church plant, I think about 3 years old in Seacoast, New Hampshire. And they're working with refugee families there that they've sponsored over the last 2.5 years. You'll get to hear his story, hear a little bit. That is really, he kind of brings a case study to it for us. Wes was also, though, in business and in tech and software startups for about a decade and a half. So we may actually pick his brain on some of those topics and how it applies to this subject as well. And then last, we have my friend Josh Howard. Josh has lived in India for, we're 15 years? How long were you there?
16 and a half, yeah.
16 and a half years in Des Moines. I've been to Des Moines. 16 and a half years in Des Moines is like a century anywhere else. I mean, it is in the boonies.
It is. It's far out there.
But Josh has, I mean, a real passion for the kingdom of God, to see it spread throughout the world through churches that plant other churches and disciple making. He's currently serves as a global mobilization catalyst for E3 partners, and probably with this conversation, I think really brings a global perspective. So you can see there's a unique kind of, I think, expertise that each of our panelists bring to this whole conversation, and I'm excited to have all three of them with us. And again, just if you're still logging on, looks like we got a good number of people on here. This is great. We would love to hear your questions. What questions you have for us, go ahead and just put them in the Q&A there. And as we have time, we will try to get to those throughout this webinar. But I'll tell you what, to get us started though, I think it's probably important. I'm going to start with you, Daniel. Give us a little bit of historical context on this subject. I mean, how has the history of immigration shaped church movements in America, and particularly like church planting movements?
Yeah, great question, Dave. And thanks again for having us on, and appreciate your leadership in Exponential. Just super excited that you all are engaging in this conversation. And I know you personally, you can also talk about this because of your personal experience in this, and then also the church that you lead. So thanks again for having us. Just taking a step back real quick, you all are, you may be familiar with the poem that's etched on the Statue of Liberty. You've heard it before, you may have read it. It says, it's a sonnet called the New Colossus. And a part of it says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. A wretched refuse," that's an interesting word to be used, "of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest toast to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." It's a beautiful poem. It was etched in the Statue of Liberty, reminds us of what this country was built on and why it was built. Man, if we go back even before the founding of the United States, the American Revolution, 1776, and the Declaration of Independence, in the 17th century, when the Puritans began arriving, the reason why they began arriving was because of religious and political persecution. They came to the new colonies because they wanted to be in a place where they can practice their religion in a way that was free. It's deeply embedded into the history. You can go further back into the indigenous people when they began arriving and some of the factors that led to them coming here. But when you talk about immigration in the church, it's in the history of the founding of our country, even before that. So you have to think about the Puritans. You have to think about why they came here. And it was, again, to find religious freedom. And then a couple of centuries later, you have to begin looking at some of the other European religious groups that came here. The Swedish, the Germans, they came here for the same reason, to find religious freedom. They established what we now know as some of the free churches, the EV Free, the Evangelical Covenant churches, Converge, which is Baptist Swedish. And these were immigrant groups that came early on to find religious freedom. And so they planted churches and they started churches. Anecdotally, let me give you a little bit of an example of the church that I attend now here in Aurora, Illinois. My family, we planted a church and then we re-entered into an immigrant church to help them revitalize and replant. But they were in a building in downtown Aurora that used to be, it was founded by a Lutheran German congregation. And that Lutheran congregation led that church for years. They established another church on the west side of Aurora where I live now, and so have a larger campus. They handed that church down to a Baptist church, which eventually handed that church building down to the Hmong Immigrant Church, which last year sold that building to an Indian immigrant church. And this is the nature of, that's a microcosm. It's the history of the development of the church in America. And so we're in a time where we feel like things are so unique and it's so different and the policies are so, this way or that way. But the reality is that this has always been the history of America, and the church has always been intertwined. And just, kind of the last thing is that 1 in 4 immigrants come to the United States already Christian, and a vast number of refugees that come to the United States are persecuted Christians. And so just as we hear the rhetoric around immigrants and refugees, we have to remind ourselves that many of them are our sisters and brothers in Christ.
Well, and I think one of the things that I've recently become aware of, I think even through your influence and others, is kind of the simple idea that, we're all immigrants. I mean, sometimes I might go look at Daniel and go, oh, he's a Hmong immigrant, and I'm just like a white guy who's always been here. That's not the case. I mean, if I actually do the homework,
That's right.
What I actually find out is, no, I have a story. It goes back a few more generations, but also am an immigrant. And that I think that helped me do a reframing on this whole conversation. Thank you for that. And I know that there's probably, and we actually have a question from somebody already asking about, sounds like they're working with Afghans and asking the question, what do you think are the most difficult areas in helping American churches with immigrants? So maybe let's combine some thoughts. We just kind of got a brief history there. What are some key lessons learned that might speak to these areas of difficulty that kind of help us move forward into the future?
Yeah, I know, Wes, in particular, you have had a lot of, done a lot of work with Afghans in particular, but I want to share a fun story, and then Wes, you should probably tackle this one. I just came back from Tulsa, working with one of our partner churches in Tulsa, and they went through a journey, and they went through working with Afghan refugees, and had a believer, had one of their refugees become a follower of Jesus. Before 2021, before the fall of Kabul, there were 0 Afghan churches in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Today, there are 2 Afghan churches in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Just think about that. Like, the history of Tulsa There's never, ever been an Afghan church. And today, and again, not saying that the fall of Kabul and what's happened in Afghan justifies what's happening, but what God uses and does out of hurt and conflict and war. I mean, there's 2 churches meeting in Tulsa now that are Afghan. So I just think it's some amazing, positive, hopeful things happening. But Wes, I know you're in particular working with Afghans.
Yeah, no, I think to to set the stage, I need to give a little bit of our backstory and just kind of how we stumbled into working with refugee resettlement. My church community and the surrounding community, they would tell you that they benefit more from working with the different refugee families than the families themselves. It's a common refrain they insist all the time, saying, I benefit more from the particular role I'm playing, whether it's a realtor, whether it's someone who is a para at a school, whether it's someone who is in healthcare and is helping, with just the day-to-day journey of these families. But the way we got started, our church plant is 3 years old, and at 6 months, December 21, so just when we're coming out of COVID, going into 22. Remember how stable that time was? And my wife came to me, she said, I've got the greatest idea. We have an opportunity to sponsor an Afghan family of 8, soon to be 9, because the mother's pregnant. We have to do this. So I and it was just one of those things.
All right, so Wes, like legit, like when she's saying it, it's probably the right thing to do, but what are you really thinking as a church planter? And you're like, how many years into this church plant?
Yeah, 6 months.
Okay, 6 months into it. Come on, let's what are you really thinking? What's all the thoughts going on?
So I mean, as a church planner, I'm a risk taker. So I'm like, all right, let's just double down. Like we've laid it all on the table. So yeah, like what's one more bet? And so all right, this looks amazing. We ended up Park Street Church in Boston was our initial one that we worked with. They helped us kind of get started on that. But we met with our church, about 40 people at that point, and said, what do you think? Should we do this? And 100%, everyone was like, yes, let's do this. So then we started down that journey, and we put out on social media and through the town newsletter, we put out an offer and said, if anyone wants to help our church, this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be welcoming a family from Afghanistan. We thought, if we get 3-4 people, that would be amazing. Like 6, oh my gosh, that'd be awesome. At the end of it, we had 120 people from our community get involved with that initiative. We had people that we had known in the community come and knock on our door and say, hey, I saw what your church is doing. I'm not a religious person, but this is awesome. Can I get involved? Like, what church planter in New England has that experience happen to them? And so we were just blown away by that experience. And then when the conflict in Ukraine broke out, we had a small group raise their hand and say, we got to do something. And then when we became aware of the overcrowding in Boston and Massachusetts, particularly with Haitian immigrants, we had another subgroup raise their hand and say, we got to do something. And then most recently with a family from Guatemala. So 7 families that our community has sponsored. But we have just found that it's supremely challenging, but it is something that has wanted to happen within our community. I feel like there was just so many people in our community that were frustrated. They saw the fall of Kabul, they saw the conflict break out in Ukraine, and they wanted to do something. And then this family from Afghanistan, this family from Ukraine showed up, and our community just they not only roll out the roll carpet, but what I saw as a church planner, I saw like, this is how my community expresses the God-shaped hole in their heart. It's almost like they intuitively get Matthew 25, and they see the person of Jesus come to them in these marginalized, vulnerable people, and they just it unleashes something beautiful within our community. So it has been rocket fuel for our church plant's attempt to fulfill the Great Commission. And we've just seen it increase favor with the community. We're working hand in glove with schools. We've got partnerships with different town governments, and it has just been incredible, the doors that it has opened and the warm reception that we've gotten there. So that's the upside.
That is super encouraging to hear. 'Cause what I hear you say, well, a couple of things come to mind. I had a mentor, Bob Buford, and one of the things that he had a handful of principles he tried to live by, and one of them, and it's really more about from an entrepreneur and having a background in business, you might appreciate this as well. He would say, always work with what's trying to happen.
Yeah.
Always work with what's trying, and that's what I hear you say. It was like trying to happen. And so part of the result for you has been not only to be a part of kind of bringing God's kingdom to earth, restorative justice, but also it sounds like it resulted in evangelistic opportunities as well.
Oh, yeah, it's unbelievable. I've got some really funny stories just about the initial resistance that people would have to church that our community would say, absolutely not. But then on the other side, if I go out into our community and I say, hey, we're welcoming this refugee family, 100% of my community, and we live in a post-Christian community north of Boston, like we're one of the lowest, involvement in church in the U.S. 100% of my community will say, that is awesome. How can I help with that? And so it just opens up doors in incredible ways.
Well, thanks for what you're doing. Thanks for the story. That's encouraging. Hey, Josh, I mean, in some ways, you're kind of a global citizen. I would love to think, what opportunities do you see for church planting among immigrant population today as you look, really, let's just say across the Western world, but maybe in particular in the U.S.?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's funny that you guys are talking about in the Western nations. I mean, we also served similar to what Wes is doing with even Afghani refugees in India, which is crazy. But there are, I mean, thousands of Afghani refugees in Delhi and Mumbai and places like that. And they actually started planting churches among them there. And then when we look at what God is doing in the West, I mean, every single one of us as leaders and disciples of Christ have been called to make disciples of the nations. And the Great Commission is clear that he wants every tribe, every tongue, every nation to come to his feet. And here's the crazy part. We're living in unprecedented times where the nations are coming to us. I mean, there are literally people from almost every unreached people group you can imagine now within our borders, which is just amazing to think about. And just in India, we would see, Afghani refugees reached in Delhi. They would then share the gospel with friends back in Afghanistan or family back in Afghanistan, and the gospel would start spreading that way as well. And so there is tremendous opportunity right now in America that is unprecedented with reaching out, loving, and serving those immigrants within our cities and our communities. And what ends up happening, the exponential impact, yes, tongue in cheek, but the exponential impact that can happen is unbelievable because we don't know who their oikos is, who they know still in these other nations, what they're going to be sharing with, and the impact that they make. I've got a buddy of mine in Denver that is really focused on multiplying house churches and multiplying micro churches. And many people throw out there because they're on track this year in North America alone, Dave, to see close to 20,000 baptisms in North America throughout their network, which is unheard of in America. Sometimes in China or India or Africa, you hear those numbers, not in America. And somebody told him, you're the first disciple-making movement in North America. And he said, no, we're not a North American disciple-making movement. We're a South Asian disciple-making movement in North America. And what he means by that is the large majority of people coming to faith and getting baptized and multiplying disciples are actually from South Asian or South American nations. It's not even, traditional American people. These are immigrants that are coming to faith and then multiplying like crazy. And so the opportunity that we have right now is incredible to not only see the nations reach that are in our borders, but also see them become disciples who multiply and begin to plant churches. And so I love hearing, Wes, your story and Daniel, yours, because as we step out and be faithful in this, we have no idea the impact that it's going to make, not only in our nation, but as that gospel spreads through social circles across the world, the impact that can make in those nations as well.
Yeah. Daniel, you might be able to verify this, but am I right about this? I think the Assembly of God is the only growing denomination. Maybe there's two now. I heard the Nazarenes are going to have an uptick this year, which is pretty exciting. But so the Assembly of God is growing, and really the delta and the reason that they're growing is because of Spanish-speaking church plants.
Yeah, so historically, if you look at Protestant or evangelical denominations, the Assemblies of God are the only ones that have grown year after year for the last 30 years. There's several newer denominations like the PCA and ACNA that kind of started off in the last 10, 15 years. But if you look at the long trajectory, they're the only ones. And statistically, back in 2001, 1.8 million Assemblies of God would have identified as white, and then 0.4 would have identified as non-white. Fast forward, not even 20 years later, 1.8 million, the same number, would identify as white. And then all of the noticeable growth, 0.9% of the denomination was non-white, and largely Latino churches. It's safe to say that, and this is true about Southern Baptists too, and other Protestant denominations, that among the growing percentage within denominations, it's because of immigrants and immigrant church planting. Southern Baptists would plant over 50% of their churches are non-Anglo. And so I think this is a part of just the dynamics of the world coming here. And again, reminding ourselves that the world isn't just coming here to be reached. The world is coming here to do the reaching as well. That's part of my story. I mean, Raj, who helps lead Exponential with you, Dave, is Indian American, born in India. So, I mean, this is just we're no longer the church in Jerusalem in America. We're the church in Antioch. And that really is sort of a paradigm shift for many of us.
Dan, go ahead and just take a couple minutes and share your story. And then I want to go to some of the Q&A. Share your story. I think for those who haven't heard your story, I think that also kind of speaks to the importance of why people like Wes and hopefully myself, we're doing things in a local church like this.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I mean, it's funny, Dave, thanks for plugging my book, Becoming a Future Ready Church. I'm writing a book about the future of the American church, when the reality is that my family, we've only been followers of Jesus for one generation. We were refugees from Laos, and lived in refugee camps in Thailand. In 1979, a little small church in East Moline, Illinois, sponsored us. So same thing that Wes's church did with that Afghan family of 8 people. Our family was a family of 4 at the time. I was number 5 because I was in utero. My mom was pregnant with me when we landed here. 3 months later, I was born. And our sponsor, so would have been equivalent to Wes's wife, her name was Janet, and she named me Daniel before we were followers of Jesus. Because of that church, my dad became the first follower of Jesus in the history of our family. And so that church was our entry into not just American life, but the kingdom of God. We eventually attended a Baptist church where they helped disciple my family and also helped them to become American citizens. I still have the Bible that they gave us in 1985 when we became citizens. And then 2 years later, my dad, just 7 years into the faith, was a part of planting a church in East Moline there. So kind of full circle moment, but just kind of the neat thing with that is that all of my siblings, there's 5 of us, we've all been involved in planting churches, launching ministries, and where I sit kind of as a missiologist for North America. I see this as really, it's not a unusual story. I mean, God is doing this thousands and thousands of times in the United States and in Western Europe. Some of the largest churches in Western Europe are led by Nigerians, and so this is just the nature of it. Sometimes people feel like it's scary, because it feels like the great replacement, but it really isn't that. I mean, it really is the global church that's emerging from American soil, and we are it. Not me and my family's story, but yours and my story together. We are it.
Yeah, and my Tuesday night small group, kind of like you, Wes, at the urging of my wife, we've adopted an asylum-seeking family, and actually, because I know Daniel and I know his story, like in the back of my head is like, hey, maybe one of those kids, will be the next, World Relief Director who's doing, churches of welcome or helping plant, churches in 4 different cities across the United States and advocating for movement making and multiplication. So it's just kind of cool. So yeah, I love your story, Daniel. Thank you for that. We do. I'm going to jump into a question. We're getting a bunch of questions, and we're going to try to get to a few of these. Dr. for Chris Brooks asked this question, and whoever wants to jump in here, maybe we'll start with Daniel. How do we all as immigrants, including white Americans, I think he's picking up on what I said, reframe this immigration conversation within the American church? Do you have got any kind of bullet that one to start with, and then Wes and Josh jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. If it's the Chris that I'm thinking of, I appreciate your asking here, because I think it is really important, because so much of our framing has been built around sort of a European American imagination for immigration, and so it's a good time, especially given this week as the recording of this week, as we're going into election week, for us to ask that question again. Theologically, I think about the Imago Dei, I think about the Missio Dei, and I think about the Modus Dei. Everything sounds better in Latin. Image of God. We all are image bearers. Missio Dei, the mission of God. God's mission has a church, and we're it. And then the movement of God. God is working through people on the move. I think these things are sort of the new framing that we should use, so that we don't frame it primarily through our American political identity, because for many of us, we grew up in that. 1950, you have the emergence of American civil religion. It was there before, but 1950, because America becomes the superpower, replacing the British Empire at that point, American civil religion is prominent. That's when one nation under God is inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance. That's when flags are being placed at the front of sanctuaries and chapels. And so we were Christians. I say we, Americans were Christians, but we're also institutions of American civil liberty. And it's hard to break free of that. We have to come back to a theological, biblical, and also a historical approach to this. And I think that's the opportunity. So, Chris, to answer your question, I think that we have to, one, see that we are all guests on this land. There were people that beat us to it long time ago. All across the Americas, there were indigenous and native people that made it here tens of thousands of years ago, depending on whether you're a young earther or old earther. And even the issues at the southern border, we have to remind ourselves. There's a saying down in the South that, hey, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And that's a reminder that there have been indigenous people here for a long, long, long time, and we're all guests. And so we can't reverse history, and we might not be able to repair all of history. But I think it's very important for us to have our modern day conversation around immigration with the historical and then also a theological frame.
Yeah, and go ahead, Wes.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff or Wes, either one.
Yeah, I was going to say, I approached this from just exactly what Daniel said. We approached it from a theological perspective. There was also a practical and then just a heart level. So from a practical level, we partnered with local businesses and with local, the local schools and everything. And I've had business owners come to me and say, Wes, this is not charity. These, the employees that have come, these are now essential to my business. And so I could tell you 3 or 4 case studies of significant benefit to the business owners. We've got business owners calling us every week saying, hey, are you going to sponsor another family? Because for the types of jobs that would be open to these families, I mean, our business community is screaming for the types of dependable, reliable workers that are going to be a part of this program. So from a practical perspective, there is that. And then from an emotional perspective, ask Annie to share a link with some help from people and with Daniel helping me. We wrote an article about the effect of sponsored family and how I saw it bridge the political divide in our community. I saw people who, were red and blue, but they are together helping the Afghan father, teach him how to drive. And I just saw so many incredible bridges being built when they weren't talking about, the divisive talking points, but they were focused on a human being, and it just shattered it just shows how fragile those talking points are in the face of the kingdom of God breaking in the midst of a community.
Yeah, Wes, I'll add to, I think you're making an incredible point there, because I think it's important for us to realize, regardless of which direction this country goes politically, like leave that aside for a moment. The call that God has given the church to love those that are in difficult situations and love the hurting and the broken does not change, regardless of where the country goes politically. And so the mission that God has given us as a church in America is the same, no matter who's in the presidency, no matter if it's red or blue or purple or wherever. What really matters is, are we living out the mission, like Daniel said, the mission of God? Are we living that out faithfully and loving those around us, no matter what the political climate is? And so when we have immigrants and refugees in our communities, regardless of what direction the country goes, it is our job as the church to love them, to take care of them, to reach out to them. And like you mentioned earlier, Wes, live out the Matthew 25. If they're hungry, they're thirsty, they're without a home, they're in a difficult spot. We are then called by God, regardless of what our nation says, called by God to love these people and to shine the light of Jesus in these people's lives and hearts. And I think we have got to proclaim the kingdom mindedness of what you guys are talking about, Wes and Daniel. Like that has to trump everything else that's going on in our hearts and lives. Is gonna be a kingdom perspective and a biblical perspective on the way that we need to treat and love those around us.
Yeah, I would say from a practical perspective, start small. That I recognize very much that how intractable some of these controversies can seem. And let's just remember, for a lot of this, the conflict is the point. These are all injected into the conversation space. Like there is no solution, but the church, the ecclesia, can provide it can be a sign of what is possible, and that by doing something small, just starting with one family, you're going to see people come off the bench that had been in your church. You're going to see people from the very periphery of your community. They're going to emerge from the mist in the most beautiful way to come around you and say, finally, I've been waiting for our church to be about this. And so I just say, find some place to start small, lead with the human need, lead with the human story, and just constantly just put that out there. Let the talking heads say what they say, but lead with the emotional impact of the human story and the human need. And you're going to see just the most incredible, like little communities popping up and little stories popping up that you're going to be able to tell, to push back the damaging narratives that
That's super helpful. I mean, start small, love your neighbor. I mean, do those things. And yeah, let all this up here can continue to kind of back and forth. But if we'll focus on that, I mean, I'm not only hearing is it going to make a difference in the community and in people's lives, but it can also it can unite communities together too.
Oh yeah.
Let's do this real quick too. No, go ahead. Were you going to say something, Wes?
I'll just share one quick story there.
Yeah.
With the Afghan family, it just this is what galvanized we had 160 people that were involved, but it was the first day of school for the two Afghan girls that were both over 13 years old. And that's important for this, that they're both over 13. My wife and I got over there to help them get on the school bus. And they got on the bus drove away. It was just this beautiful March, bluebird, cold New England day. And the parents were just overly emotional, came over to us, and they're broken English trying to say, thank you for saving us. We didn't understand why they were so emotional. But this was, I think it was April 22nd. But we got in our car to drive away. And that's when we heard the NPR announcer said, today, the Taliban has rolled back the permission for girls over 13 to go to school. And so it was the last day of school in Afghanistan. And we could still see the school bus ahead of us as these two girls, like the world is opening up to these two girls. So I took a picture. I took the picture of those two girls crossing the road. It's in that article that Andy posted. And I said to our community, you did this. And I still have people stop me in the grocery store and say, I love that. That our community is hungry for impact, hungry to make a difference. And the church is in a unique position to deliver that,
Yeah. Thanks for that story. And thanks for your passion.
Thanks.
For that very, very much. Let's kind of, well, I'll tell you, I want to do two things because I'm looking, we got a bunch of questions and and I know we only got 10 more minutes. Daniel, is there a place where people who have these questions, is there a place that they can go, or is there a what's your recommendation if we don't get through all these questions, where they can get more information on this topic or learn more?
Yeah, certainly. I just sent Andy a link to our website that we've got some resources that we've developed for churches to host these conversations, and not just to host, but to close the gap in proximity. Meaning, how do you get to the point where you're like Wes's church and you're actually bridging the divide between your community and new communities? So what's that first engagement look like? So churchesofwelcome.com. Andy's going to put out there. You all can certainly go there, and then any questions there will be directed to me and my team. And but I think the important thing that I'm hearing Wes say, and really I think is really important beyond just knowledge, is that it's hard to really get to the point where you're actually seeing kingdom things happen until you actually have face-to-face, like life on life interaction with people that are different from you. And I'll say it this way: unless you're eating with people, it's really hard to really have a more in-depth conversation. And it's hard. It's not easy. When you're sitting across the table with somebody who eats differently, and there's a language barrier, and you're like, man, we're not just doing this one time. This is a 6-month, 12-month journey. It forces you into a certain kind of relationship, but that makes your advocacy deeper and more real. And it actually helps like your family life, because you have real conversations with your children about those that are new to their school and how to have better conversations with their classmates around their experience. And I think it's really important that if you want to see your church change on this issue, then it may start with your dinner table, and how do you actually welcome people into your home. And so we've even developed resources around hospitality and evangelism. And so I think it really does come down to closing the gap so that you're in proximate spaces with people.
That's helpful. Even my small group just Tuesdays, we're talking about this asylum seeking family that we've adopted. And it just recently, it's only been the last like month and a half. We're figuring out how can we actually share a meal together, and probably like a Thanksgiving a meal together with them. So that's I'm looking forward to that. I got a couple of questions, one from Nathan and one from Sunil, and I'm going to kind of combine them. Nathan's kind of asking the question, talking about how they have a growing number of Persian immigrants connecting to their English-speaking congregation, who it sounds like, they're ministry-minded and very evangelistic. So on the one hand, he's asking, how do we pour gas on the missional fire that they have? Okay, I think so. It's kind of more contagious within the English-speaking congregation. But then we also have Sunil, who's asking, how do you envision immigrant believers if they really only have a vision for their own survival right now? Does that make sense? So it's kind of like everybody, you got people, I'm just trying to survive, and you got these others who are really zealous. How do we actually spread that zeal amongst the whole church? I'll throw it out to Josh. What do you think, Josh?
I that's an incredible question. Let me talk about the pouring fire on the gasoline to help things get more zealous. I think one thing that we've focused on, at least we've tried to focus on, is really training and equipping everyday ordinary people like this, whether they're immigrants or refugees, or even everyday people within the church, or in the English-speaking church even, with simple reproducible tools that they can use with anyone, anywhere, in order to be more intentional about living on mission. And so I think if we can keep things as simple and reproducible and train and equip everybody, we're talking about reclaiming the priesthood of all believers, that we've got to get everybody, we've got to cast vision to everybody, make sure they're trained and equipped. And that will include whether it's an immigrant or a refugee or an English-speaking person in your church. If we can make sure that they're trained and equipped well with this vision and strategy, and then equip them on how to have conversations like what Daniel was saying with other types of people from different backgrounds. Sharing the gospel, for example, with a Hindu background believer, or a Hindu background person, or a Muslim background person, or a Buddhist background person, can have different caveats that you could be trained and equipped in, that are simple ways to have conversations with people from those different backgrounds. And so I think just connecting with groups that offer training for stuff like this and getting as many people in those churches trained and equipped with simple, reproducible tools, that's going to help the fire spread much faster when people feel confident and competent to be able to go and help with these things and then to be on mission with one another. So how do we train the people within our churches and the immigrants that are coming to faith on how they can then spread that and share it with their friends and family as well? And then we can kind of help that spark continue to multiply that way.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Josh. Hey, quick question, Wes and Josh. I'm trying to figure out how we can make the most of our time. Can you guys see the Q&As coming through?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I'll tell you what. I got one from Russell here. I'm going to throw to Daniel. And while Daniel's answering that question, why don't you guys sift through those rest of the questions after the one from Russell and pick out one that you'd like to answer, and I'll give you each one, and then we'll kind of come back with a wrap up. How's that sound? So we'll multitask here. Daniel, Russell says this: I have a Slav background, and in the U.S., we're now connected to 100 Slavs who have planted English-speaking churches or English services all across the U.S. Says it does have some unique challenges and opportunities. But here's the question: what are some resources, conferences out there for ethnic leaders planting community churches?
Yeah, great question. And we have several similar ministries, Russell, here in Chicago that would resonate, whether Russians, Eastern Ukrainian, or Eastern Europeans and Ukrainians. So growing population. There are several ministries focused towards multi-ethnic church planting or networks. I mean, Mosaics would probably be the one that's most prominent for most people. When it comes to like ethnic second gen conversations, which I think, it's not always true of English services, but English services tend to bend towards second generation immigrants. There's a lot of Advanced Initiative is one that works with second generation Indians. And I know, although that's a little bit slightly different than Slavic speaking people or Slavic people, you can see a little bit of an imagination for how to cast a vision for second generation leaders that haven't left their ethnic identity, but then also they're engaging their Americanness and their non-Indian neighbors. And so Advanced Initiative could give you an idea for that. And then, Dave, our friend Ron Zappia here in Chicago, they've done an amazing job. They're High Point Church, and they have a thriving congregation, Russian-speaking congregation that serves Slavic people that's planting other churches as well. And so, Russell, if you're interested in connecting with their work here in Chicago, I'd love to connect you with them as well.
Very good. Josh, did you find a question you'd like to give a shot at?
Yeah, let's hope I'm not stealing Wes's question he picked. But the very last one here on the Q&A is from Nathan. He basically says, how do we help reach more Persians in the city? And I'm gonna actually generalize that a little bit more, not just with Persians specifically, but just people that are either immigrants or refugees generally in a city. He's basically saying, as a largely white English church, how do we move forward in that and actually reach out to them and things like that? And what we're seeing over and over again, guys, that has been incredibly impactful, and we've already mentioned some of the practical things, but a lot of times, a lot of these immigrants and refugees are living in certain areas of the city. They tend to stick close together when they're from backgrounds of similar cultures. And when they do that, intentionally going into those places with a few other people, starting to have spiritual conversations. We even have a practice that we train people on that is literally, we just call it prayer walking, but it's really going into these communities, praying that God would open doors of opportunity and open conversational opportunity with these people. I think that's going to be huge. And then beginning to form those relationships. At the end of the day, we serve a relational God who longs for us to put on flesh the way that he did. He literally put on flesh and came to earth. We need to meet these people where they are and really form relationships with them. And not only that, I think the second key point that has been incredibly helpful for us is partnering with native believers if you can find them, and really partner with them and come alongside of them. So for example, right here in Indianapolis where we're at, we've started partnering with some Hindi speaking churches in the area that are Indian background believers, in order to help reach out to other Indians in the area. So we're coming alongside of immigrant believers in order to reach more people that are in that community with the gospel as well. And so I think it's really a two-pronged approach. Being intentional ourselves, going into areas that these people live, work, and play, going and shopping at some of their places, going to some of their grocery stores that they have, meeting people like that, having spiritual conversations, and then coming alongside of believers in those communities and helping empower them, train and equip them, and come alongside them to see it happen. I think those two are probably the quickest, more practical steps that I would encourage people to take as they really try to reach out. Really intentionality.
All right. Thank you for that question, Nathan. Wes, did you pick out one?
Yeah, there's a couple here. There's one from, let's see, from Joel about mobilizing everyday people, ordinary people. And I'd say that's what I've seen is that's the rocket fuel to this. That we've, over the last 2.5 years, we've worked with Welcome NST as our partner on sponsorship, and then now found ways to collaborate with Daniel and World Relief on this. But both of those orgs are just provide the practical everyday tools to help people. A lot of churches were trying to ask, how do we get the 80%, off the bench and engaged? And we've found that coming alongside is just such a catalyst to get people, engaged, who are not going to be involved in some of the more typical church things. I had a member of our church sketch for me. He called it the wealth quadrant. He said, these are the type of people I see getting involved. They're in the wealth quadrant. And he's had 4 eyes. Income and influence were 2 of the eyes. And then the other 2 were impact and intimacy. And he said, what I see happening is those who have a lot of influence and income, they are hungry for impact and intimacy. And so we're digging a ditch for these 2 to come together. And so it's such a beautiful picture of discipleship, of helping people, just use skills that they use every day. If they're a realtor or if they're a school teacher or a healthcare provider, and I'm just giving them a ride, but it's just these incredible moments of serving and they're impact. They're seeing impact. They're building relationships, and they're lifting up those that they're coming alongside. And it's really I'd say that just getting involved while alongside is one of the greatest things to mobilize the church that we've seen.
All right. Thank you, Wes. And thank you, Joel, for the question. Man, I'll tell you what, this 45 minutes has flown by. We're going to have to do this again. Let's do this. Panelists, just 1 minute. Okay. 1 minute. If you can add one challenge or maybe one next step. We got a lot of church leaders out there that are obviously very interested in this conversation. They see both the need and the tremendous opportunity. So if you had a challenge or hey, here's the next step, and we'll start with Josh, and then we'll go to Wes, and then we'll wrap up with Daniel.
Yeah, I would say I've already mentioned a couple, but I'd say really, I would encourage every single person listening. We've got to lead this from the front. We've got to, if you're leading a church, or even if you're not, even if you're a layperson within the church, we've got to show other people what this practically looks like. And so the challenge I would give is find an organization. We offer it, and I know a lot of others do as well, to just get trained in simple, reproducible tools that you can put into practice right away in order to really begin to live this out and come alongside of immigrant communities in order to really love them, disciple them, and then help them multiply and multiply disciples and churches in their communities. And each and every one of us can do this. We're all called by God to do it. And so I'd say let's lead this from the front. Let's practice it in front of others, and let's get as much training into our people as we can to show them those simple, reproducible tools they can use that they can then equip others with as well.
Outstanding. Thanks.
Yeah.
Wes, what do you think?
I'd say exactly what Josh said. And if you're a leader and you're considering taking your church or a small group, go and experience that yourself first. Just go and when you see that moment of it'll overwhelm you just to realize that here the risen Jesus is coming to you in the form of someone who is vulnerable and in need. Have that experience first, and then you'll see like, oh, this is what I want for my congregation. But have that experience.
All right. Thanks, Wes. And thanks again for your example. It's super, super encouraging.
This is my wife. She's the one.
And your wife, well, of course.
I think that's true of all of us, Wes. It's always our wives.
Hey, Daniel, what would you say? Challenge or kind of clear next steps?
I think the greatest challenge to this is fear, fear of unknown. It just to be quite, kind of frank about the different categories. There's groups of people, not necessarily just whites and Americans who have been here for a long time, but people have a fear of erasure, or fear of losing something, being taken advantage of. Then there are fears that new arrivals and immigrants and minorities have, which is fear of of losing ethnic identity, fear of losing tradition, fear of heritage. And so I think underlying that human emotion of fear keeps us from engaging quite a bit, and so I'm reminded that the Bible gives us tremendous resources to address this fear. As you mentioned, Dave, as we were starting off, like we're all sojourners, let's replace that word immigrant with sojourner. And from the very first pages of the Bible to the very last pages, it addresses the sojourner. And I'm thinking about Hebrews, where it talks about Abraham, the father of our faith. And we knew that Abraham stepped out, left Ur and went to the promised land without knowing what was in front of him. And then the Hebrews writer concludes in Hebrews 11 that says, Abraham, he wasn't doing that for physical land. He was doing it because he knew that there was going to be a heavenly city. So whether you're an immigrant pastor, or whether you're, a suburban megachurch white pastor trying to figure out how to engage your community, I think we need to reframe our theological imagination that the Bible has always talked about our enterprise that we're involved in as we're all sojourners, and so we're all on a journey towards a more heavenly city, a more heavenly reality. And I think that needs to constantly be infused with each generation to give them a new missional imagination. Because if the narrative primarily is that America used to be a Christian nation and we want to get back to that, that's only going to resonate with a small group of people. But if we're reminded that, as you had mentioned earlier, Josh, Philippians chapter 2, Jesus gave up his rights, incarnated himself. That's always been the MO. Our MO has always been to give up our rights and privileges on behalf of other people. That is the core identity of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And I'll end with this last thought. Leslie Newbegin posed a series of questions in the 1980s when he came back from India, and he was reimagining the West as a missionary enterprise. And he asked the question, can the West be converted? Because he looked at the UK and he was like, man, it's just as lost as India, where I came from. And he started asking that question. And ever since then, for the last 30 years, most of us Westerners had assumed that it was going to be the West that was going to reach the West, And so the Gospel in Our Culture Network and many writers since then, Guter and John Franke, every other person writing, the assumption was the West was going to reach the West. But what we're seeing, without tons of strategy, God behind it, is that God is actually using the world to reach the West. As a matter of fact, he's using the world to disciple the Western church. And that makes me hopeful. It aligns with Scripture. And I think that's really what God had in mind on Pentecost.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Josh. Thank you very much, Wes. Thank you very much, Daniel. And thank you all of you for joining us. And thank you for your just terrific interaction and your very obvious interest in this subject. I'd encourage you to check out also exponential.org for all things exponential. We do have what we call Exponential Next, which takes a look at the future of things. It brings you conversations like this and also books like Daniel's. So make sure you check that out. We also have our conferences. We got one coming up in Chicago that looks like it's going to sell out. So if you're planning on coming to Chicago, you got to get your tickets now. Our global conference has already sold out for next March, but we are working on kind of an enhanced digital experience. So we'd love to have you check that out. We also have our whole mobilization stream, which really helps you make that shift from not just thinking about how do I grow my church, but how can we multiply God's kingdom, which is a really, really important shift. So anyways that Exponential can help you, my email's even on the website there. Email me. We would love to serve you in any way we can. So really on behalf of both Exponential and our friends at World Relief and Churches of Welcome, we want to say thank you so much for joining us for this webinar.